Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. It's Matt here from LoopSpeed. So in today's video we're going to be building this. It's a nice little UI transition that could be used inside a menu, sort of a web application. As you can see, it's able to handle resizes and update the layout. It's also running at 60 frames per second, has good browser compatibility. So we're going to be building this UI transition into a React app using GSAP, which is the GreenSock animation platform. The method we'll be following is what I've called ICAS. It's a sort of smoke and mirrors approach in that the elements exist twice in the DOM in their large and small states. We transition each element to its paired element and then switch the visibility and interaction over. We do this because we need to animate the transform and scale values to ensure high frame rates, and we also need to handle the window resizing. As soon as the window resizes, the elements will be moved out of place because their transform is relative to where they begun. So despite some obvious drawbacks, this approach seems to be the best solution, and as I've just shown, it works pretty well. I mentioned the ICAS method, so I'm just going to go over that really quickly before we get started and explain the process. So the I stands for identify. We identify where it starts and where it should end. We do this by fetching the elements. We then calculate the transformations required to transition from position A to position B. We do this through comparing the bounding rects. We then animate it using those values, and as I mentioned before, we only want to animate the transform values. We then switch the transitioned element with the one that can handle the resizes, and then reset the transitioned element back to its original place. This video is for people with a little bit of web development background, so that means some intermediate JavaScript know-how. I'll be using arrow functions, map, and for each. You need to have some CSS understanding too. Obviously we'll be doing all of the styling like that, and we'll also be animating the CSS properties. You also need to understand the React JSX syntax. This will all be written within a simple component. Alright, so now we're ready. Let's dive into the code. If you want to code along with me, I'll be creating this from scratch in stackblitz.com. StackBlitz is an in-browser IDE that has a really straightforward React project setup. So that's what I'll be doing. Okay, you can rename your project up here. Okay, we'll open in a new window so that we've got more space to code, and in this part I'm going to basically set up the project and get everything ready. So I'm going to delete what's been returned in the render method. I'm going to delete what's in the state, delete the imported hello component, delete it from the side. Okay, save that. Style, delete that. So I've got a blank page. Okay, so what do we need? We need to have a container for these top elements. We need a container for these bottom elements. So as I mentioned earlier, the ICAS method is sort of smoke and mirrors in that although it appears to be the same element that's always on the screen, we're actually using two. And this is to handle the resizing primarily. So I've created a large elements and small elements container. Put some styling into style sheet. So the main is going to have flex because we want to center the large elements within it. So center on the X and the Y using line items and justify content. I'm going to also do the same thing for both of the element containers themselves. But on each of those, we're going to put flex wrap so that the content will drop down when the screen isn't wide enough. Okay, cool. We're also going to need a large element and a small element. So if I create those two, create classes for those now. So later on in the video, I'll go through and update the styling to look how it does in the demo. But to begin with, let's start by keeping things simple. So I'll put a background color on these so that we can identify them. If we make one blue, one black, we'll be able to differentiate them when the switch happens. Okay, so we've got a large elements container and a small elements container and large element and small element. So what we're going to do is create a function to generate those divs. And that's going to return in there. So if we do return elements, what we'll do is we can reuse the same function here. If we pass it as an is small boolean. What I want to do is actually map these elements from an array. So I'm going to define that up here. We could say give it a name. This won't actually be doing anything to begin with. So we're going to create 10 objects on the screen. These could represent, say, different applications, different modes that you might enable. Obviously, this may come from a data source elsewhere. So we've got the 10 elements there. In here, we're going to do elements.map JavaScript method. I'm going to pass that element through, and in there we're going to return a div, and that will have a class name, and the class name will be based off of the boolean that's passed in, whether it's small or not. So if it's small, it will be small element. If it's large, would be large element. Okay, so we can call that function in here. Is small, no, so that's false. And do the same thing inside small elements. So I saved that. Here's what we've got. We have them all shown on the screen. There's no spacing in them, there's no border radiuses, so I'm going to sort some of that stuff out. Also, the container for the smaller elements needs to be positioned at the bottom of the screen, so let's update that. Give it a position fixed, bottom 0. There we go. Also going to put a width 100 view width and a height 100 view height on the main. Okay, so here we got it. It's resizing down using flex, and the small elements are contained at the bottom. So that pretty much covers the basic setup. What I am going to do is put some margin onto the elements. So now it looks more recognizable as to what we have here. Okay, so now we've sorted the basic layout, I'm going to start writing the function to transition these elements. So I'm going to create a function called transition to small. Now, let me recap the method that we're going to be using. So we're going to identify where the element starts and should end, and that's x, y, and scale. We're going to calculate the transform values. I'm going to write a helper function to do that. We're then going to animate using GSAP tweenmax. Tweenmax has a stagger to function, and that allows us to iterate through a whole class of elements, or a whole array of elements, and apply a slightly different transformation to each element based off of its index. So it's perfect for what we need here. Tweenmax also handles the browser compatibility and allows us to be far more productive. So then I'm going to switch the transformed element with the underlying element. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fetch the elements that are going to be transitioned. I'm going to use the query selector all to target the elements with the class name of large element. There are other methods that you can look up. Get elements by class name is an alternative. So we've got the large elements in an array, we've got the small elements in an array. I'm going to create some empty arrays for the differences in the x and y and scale. And so this array will contain values that will be used in the tween in the stagger2 function. So what we're going to do is iterate through each of the large elements using the for each method. We're going to take element 1, but we also need its index. And we're going to work out the difference between element 1 from large elements and element 1 in small elements. So I'm going to write a function in order to do that. I'm going to call it return x, y, s difference, and we're going to pass that element 1 and element 2. What it's going to do is get the rectangle, which will let us know its absolute position and size. So if we do that like so, using the get bounding client rect function, and we'll get rectangle 2 element 2 dot get bounding client rect. Now we've got 3 different values. We need to move it on the y, the x, and its size, its scale. So we calculate its x difference by doing rectangle 2 dot left minus rectangle 1 dot left. And we do the same for the y, except we're using the top position. And the scale is its width. We could also use its height as their squares. Now I'm going to return all of those in an array. Like so. So now we've created the function to compare the bounding client rect of 2 of these elements. So in this for each function, that's what we're going to do. I'm going to do this dot return x, y, s difference, and we'll pass in element 1 and element 2. So we get element 2 from the small elements array at the index. I'm going to put that in a constant and call it transform vals. And then for each of those returned values inside that array, I'm going to push them into the corresponding array for the group of them. So we do x diffs dot push, y diffs dot push, and scale diffs dot push. So now what we've done is we've iterated through all of the large elements and compared them to their corresponding small element, and put the x difference, y difference, and scale difference into an array at the index that matches that element. Okay, so now to use GSAP, we need to install the dependency. And we need to import tweenmax from GSAP all /all. So we write tweenmax dot stagger2 we need to provide it with an ID or a class name or an element to animate. We need to specify the time for the animation. We need to define some properties, and then we specify the delay, and this is the delay between each element in the stagger, basically. So for here, we're transitioning the large element to the small element. So this is going to target every large element, and for 1 second it's going to change the following properties. Now there's a cycle function inside stagger 2 which allows us to provide a different value for each element based off of its index. So we do that like so. So here if we did return index times 10, what we'd expect to happen is first element, it would be 0 times 10, so it wouldn't transition it at all, and by the 10th element it will have moved it 100 pixels to the right. But we're not going to do that. We are going to use the index though to get the X difference value from the array. I'm going to do the same thing for Y and scale. So now we're accessing each of those, the value that corresponds to this element using the cycle function. And finally, we need to handle the switch. We can put a completion handler, and this is on the completion of all of these animations, do something. And what we're going to do is switch out the element that's just been moved, and we'll do that using Tweemax set. I'm going to use the auto alpha property, which is basically the same as setting the opacity to 0 and setting the visibility to hidden. It does it in one. So this here is resetting it, but we also need to set the underlying element to be invisible. So the small element we're going to now bring in, so we're going to set its auto alpha to 1. Now in order to test this function, let's link it up to an on-click handler. I'm just going to put it on the large elements container. Okay, so let's see what happens. Hasn't done the X and Y, has it? So you might have spotted what I did wrong, and here I forgot to open the bracket and close it correctly. Which is why scale differences was working, but the X and the Y wasn't. So now it is moving, but there's something else that's wrong. What's happening is it's scaling down and it's transitioning, it's transforming on the X and Y, and because it's scaling down, its top left position was up here, but it's now down here because the scale is 1/3 of the size. And so to resolve that, we just need to put transform origin of top left on both the small and large element. Sorry, transform origin. I think I even said it and then I didn't type it. So there we have it. They've lined up perfectly. Okay, so for the next section, we need to transition to large from small. So why don't you have a go updating the transition to small function inside a transition to large function. And I'll see you again in a few minutes. Okay, so the transition to large is largely the same. There are a few bits that we do need to update. So we're going to iterate through the small element so that the small element becomes element 1 and the large element becomes element 2. We're then going to animate the small element and not the large element because the large element is hidden. And then on the completion of it, we are going to show the large element and hide the small element and reset it. So we'll put the transition to large function on the small element. And see what happens. Okay, good. So that's working as expected. You see when the color changes, they're switching over. Now they can resize, and then they can move. They can resize, and they'll move. We do have a few issues though. If we if we click quickly, we can cause some weird behavior. So in this next section, we're basically just going to tidy up some of the code. We're going to prevent this double pressing. So I'm going to create an isTransitioning variable inside this class. And we'll set that to false. I'm also going to put a isLargeView boolean inside state. And we're going to use that to control the pointer options and also to prevent it trying to run the code to transition it when it's already in that view. So when we're going to transition to small, if it's transitioning, if this dot is transitioning, we're just going to return out. If it's already in the small view, we return out. If it passes both of those, we will then set isTransitioning to true. I'm going to put the same code at the start of the transition to large function. The only difference is we're checking if it's in large view, so we can take that out. Now in the completion, we also need to add that the transitioning is finished, so it's transitioning to true. We're also going to set the state. So if we're transitioning to small, its large view is no more, so that's false. I'm going to put that in the transition to large function completion as well. So we've got a check to see if it's transitioning, and if it is, we'll return out. We'll check to see if it's already in the view that we're trying to move it to. If it is, we'll cancel out. We'll then set transition is true, and then once all the animations have finished, we'll set it to false, not true. So now I can double tap, I can try and press lows, but it will finish its animation before trying another. Okay, a couple more things. In component did mount, we're going to set the small elements to being hidden. So we'll use tweemax.set. We'll have .small element, and we'll put the auto alpha to 0. So now it's hidden when it loads, and now it appears there. One more thing is inside the JSX, I'm going to disable pointer events on the divs, and this just means that they can't be clicked when they're hidden. So if we did this .state is large view, if it's large view, we'll enable all pointer events, and if it's not, we'll enable none. Okay, and that style will also apply to the other container, but of course we'll to the negative and check if it's in the small view. Okay, so if we test that, it still works. Okay, so awesome. We've written the transition functions and we've added a bit of code to handle some double tapping and odd interactions. Now, in this final section, I'm going to be adding the extra styling to basically make it look like this. You see, we've also transitioned the background of the small elements container so that it fades in and provides a sort of home or navbar style wrapper for them. So if we head over to the style sheet, what we're going to do is put linear gradient as a background inside of HTML, so this will just apply it everywhere. So we've got 40, 40, 40 to 80, oh no, sorry, 08, 08, 08. Where's my damn hash key? Wrong buttons. There we go. So now we've got that. Each of the elements are white, so we'll update the colors there. They both have border radiuses, so we'll put that on too. Now, one thing to note with the border radius is that we need it to, for it to be proportionately larger in each of the elements. So if we put the border radius as 24 pixels on the large element, on the small element we need to put it to 8 pixels because the scale difference is 1/3, and so if they're different, when it transitions it's going to be obvious. When it switches out it will be obvious. So if I put this to say 16 pixels, you notice when it switches they don't match. So we need to put that to 8. Okay, so in the small elements container we could put a bit of padding in it, and we could put box sizing, border box. I'm not sure that's needed actually. If we put a background color, we go RGBA 255, 255, 255 and 0.3, that will give us a 30% white background, as you see. And then we'll put a border top right radius of say 8 pixels and a border top left radius of also 8 pixels. That rounds those edges there. Actually what we want to do is transition in the background color, so I'll comment that out, but I'll copy the RGB value. Now to fade that background in, when we're transitioning to small, we'll put that as a separate tween at the end, and instead of using stagger 2 we'll just use 2. I'll just do it on the small elements for 0.5, and we'll do the background so there we see. Let's also put delay. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to add it at the end of the transition to large. But I'm going to put the opacity, the RGBA, to 0. I'll take off the delay. I'm going to make it happen a little bit quicker because the elements will be moving out right away. So let's see how that works. Okay, one thing I've just realised, we should speed up the transition for all of these elements. Currently it's 1 second, that's far too long. Something like 0.4 seconds and 0.05 delay between each of them. Yeah, it feels more snappy. Typically with a large screen animation such as that, you want it to be 0.5 or less. Okay. So 0.4 and 0.05. Okay, so there we have it. We're handling the resizes. It's running smooth and it's looking good. If you like, you could merge the transition to large and the transition to small functions into one. They don't really need to be separate functions. If we were to pass a Boolean into here, like is small or whatever, we could probably update some of this code so that we didn't have such duplication. We also need to add into the CSS some media queries to cover to change the widths and heights of these. But if we do that, it'd be wise to keep them in proportion with one another. So that pretty much concludes the video. I'm going to share the demo in the comment, and yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something new. Feedback is appreciated. Any tips that you can offer me, also very welcome. And so that's it. Have a good day.